Hello, I'm Subhash Gatade. I'm associated with the New Socialist Initiative, a left ideological political platform. I welcome you all for the 18th lecture in the Democracy Dialogue series. We are really fortunate and we are thankful to Professor Aditya Mukherjee that he has accepted our invitation and he will be sharing his ideas on 75 years of Indian independence. Where are we? Uh, you might recall that in November 2000, Aditya ji was here again for the first time, and when he had spoken about Jawaharlal Nehru's legacy, it was a time when his legacy was under attack, and he has spoken about the importance of the legacy. He doesn't need much introduction, but still for this thing for those who don't know, he has been associated with Jawaharlal Nehru University. He is a prominent voice, an eminent historian of modern Indian history. And at present, he is associated with, he edits Sage publications, Sage series in modern Indian history. He has been visiting professor at various foreign universities, right from Duke University, Lancaster University, Institute of Advanced Studies, Sao Paulo, and University of Rome as well. He is author and co-author of many books, India's Struggle for Independence, which has gone into 80 reprints, India After Independence, Imperialism, Nationalism, and the Making of the Indian Capitalist Class, India Since Independence, Penguin, more than 35 reprints since 2016, RSS School Text and the Murder of Mahatma Gandhi, which is co-authored with Professor Mukherjee and Professor Sujata Mahajan. His books have been translated into many Indian languages. And his latest book is Political Economy of Colonial and Post-Colonial India. Before I invite Professor Aditya Mukherjee, I would like to introduce Comrade Ravi Sinha and Comrade Bhargav of NSI, who will be facilitating the discussion after Professor Aditya Mukherjee's presentation. Friends, welcome Professor Aditya Mukherjee. आप शुरू कर सकते हैं?
Acha, I thought you were going to introduce Ravi Sinha also. Okay. Thank you very much, Subhash ji, Ravi Sinha ji, and the organizers of Democracy Dialogue, particularly in these dark days, for keeping the dialogue going is, as we all agree, the crux of democracy. In fact, the two words democracy dialogue are almost conjoined in the same manner as secular democracy is. One cannot do without the other. Another conjoint word now that has emerged is communal fascism. This has been coined by Amartya Sen. I think it's a very apt description of the nature of society that is emerging in India. But these are conjoint words. So thank you very much for this initiative and allowing me to participate in that initiative. I'm going to speak on where we are 75 years after independence. Very briefly, let me start with what you probably do not expect, which is to assert that much indeed has been achieved since independence. It is not as if nothing happened since independence. Very quickly, in about 5 minutes, if I can just summarize this. The first thing that happens under Nehru's leadership, or what is called the Nehruvian consensus, is the unstructuring of colonialism that we witness in the first 3 or 4 decades after independence. From a virtual neo-colonial economy, which we inherited at independence, we were politically independent, were economically totally dependent. The situation was transformed. A certain amount of self-reliance was built without shouting Atmanirbharta every other day. And if I can just describe it in one small set of figures, this is what happens. At independence, India was dependent almost 100% for any growth, because any investment required machinery and we did not produce any machinery. 95% of even machine tools like pliers and wrenches had to be imported, right? So this is what Nehru said is neo-colonial. I mean, where is the independence? And hence the strategy, the Nehru-Mahalanobis strategy, the focus on capital goods, the use of the public sector, etc. And the results are, and that one statistic speaks volumes, that by 1960, only 43% of the machinery required for investment had to be imported. And by 1974, only 9% had to be imported. In other words, by the 1970s, the first 30, 40 years, which Meghnad Desai and such likes, the neoliberals say, were wasted years, in these 40 years, India was able to reach a situation that it could manage on its own virtually 90% of its growth. And that is what gave the first requirement after independence, sovereignty, the real sovereignty to the country, an independent foreign policy, the capacity to lead 100 countries in the non-aligned movement, etc., etc. So that was one achievement worth mentioning. The second is again, not talked about. People don't even talk about as if the land reforms did not happen. You know, a 200-year-old institution, the zamindari system, is abolished within 7 years. The back of the zamindari system was broken by 1957 with democracy. No General MacArthur's army sitting on our heads. It was a great achievement. Land reforms with a lot of defects. One can spend hours telling you the defects. But the back of the zamindari system, the feudal system, was broken. And this was combined with institutional reforms. In fact, technological reforms. This land reform were the institutional reforms necessary for the next stage, the Green Revolution, which was the technological reforms, which also begins in Nehru's time, and as you know, goes forward in the 60s and 70s. And it is the combination of these two which needs to be highlighted, the land reforms and the Green Revolution, which were at that time one of the biggest anti-poverty measures. The Indian state at that time did not have the resources like it did later when it could launch the Manrega, one of the world's largest social security programs. It did not have the resources, but it did not give up one of the goals of our national movement, which is egalitarian, pro-poor orientation to our society. It in fact provided that. And when one says, one must remind that things did change. What did we inherit? At independence, the average life expectancy in India, I must remind you, was less than 30. People died in their 20s on an average, which means imagine what happened to the poor. This average includes the well-to-do, etc., well-fed and overfed and everybody else, right? So that was the condition from where we started. And as you know, today the life expectancy is over 65. And similar, one could give several other statistics. At independence, for example, 95% of our women were illiterate. More than 80% of the population and 95% of women. Now that situation does not exist. A lot needs to be done, but to say that nothing happened since independence would be wrong. Thirdly, the creating and maintaining democracy and democratic institution in a newly born state of the kind that India was, so enormously diverse, was thought at that time, pretty much globally, thought to be a foolhardy task, an impossible task. You just have to, one doesn't remember these things because once it happened, now everybody thinks, yes, a great experiment was made. But in the 1960s, people like Selig Harrison, Neville Maxwell were writing copiously about how stupid an idea this was, how Indian democracy in India could not possibly survive, and so on and so forth, right? So in the face of this situation, to actually build the democratic institutions step by step was a great step. And that too, to be able to make a transformation in the economy, both in industry and agriculture, with democracy, was a unique task in world history. It had never happened before. Anywhere else where there has been an industrial transformation or an agricultural transformation, it occurred either with slavery or through forced collectivization or through forced land tax or enclosure system. And I can give you, just think of every country that you know which has industrialized. And certainly all of them had colonies. Now, none of those conditions existed when India makes the transition after 1947. So this was a great achievement, and it was seen as such globally again. In development economics, India was seen as the example of how it is possible to make the transition with democracy. China being the example of how it is done with the absence of democracy. Lastly, and perhaps in today's context most importantly, India was able to create a secular democracy and adopt a constitution on that basis within 3 years of a Holocaust-like situation. Between 46 and 47, lakhs of people died, millions were made homeless, the communal temperature was at its peak, and yet in the very first election, the Indian people overwhelmingly, 94% of them, voted in favor of a secular India, not a Hindu Rashtra, the mirror image of Muslim Pakistan. A great achievement by any standards, which has been highly underrated. An achievement which is only possible because it was at the end of a nearly 100-year-long national liberation struggle with deep ideological moorings. Now, why do I need to state all these to begin with? Because no longer are we historians and academics and intellectuals like you are talking to each other. What the public is fed is what a starlet, I think I forget her name, Kangana Rao says, which is that asli azadi to 2014 mein aayi. India got its real independence 2014. In 1947, what we got out of beggary, bheek mang ke mila. Now, this is not just one person saying so. You should see how these statements are multiplied by the millions with a lot of support from the powers that be. Now, these need to be combated, and that's why I said this. You see, with one sweep from Dadabhai Naoroji, Tilak, Gokhale, Bhagat Singh, Gandhi, Nehru, Bose, all of them are made into bhikaris. Because wo azadi to bheek mang ke mili. See, this attempt to denigrate this great national liberation struggle by those who had not only no part in it, but were actual collaborators of the British, must be resisted. And hence, I'm going to do a bit of that as well today. Now, where are we today? This question can be answered only in relation to A, what has been achieved, and I briefly discussed that just now, and what the Indian national movement stood for, the movement which created the modern nation state, the movement which made possible the constitution, which is the distillate of the national movement. So we need to evaluate where we are today on the basis of what was that vision of that movement. It was a movement which was nearly a 100-year long movement, perhaps the biggest mass movement in world history, the victory of which set the stage for the dissolution of the formal empires all over the world. In other words, this movement had major global implications. It's a great historical event that this movement created. Therefore, let us look at what was the vision of this movement. Because this vision went deep down into the minds of the Indian people, because it was a prolonged mass movement and not just a revolutionary overthrow or a guerrilla movement. And that is the legacy that we have, which we have inherited, which we must bring to bear today when it is being threatened. That there is that legacy, a mass movement, 100-year-long mass movement with deep roots in our society. Now, what were the core ideas behind this vision of the national movement? Very briefly, this is all well known to you, but it is for the sake of argument, it's necessary to put them down. There are 4 or 5 basic ideas of the core ideas of the national liberation struggle. Sovereignty. The future India would be sovereign. It would not be a client state of one or the other superpower. It would be sovereign. It would be democratic. It would be secular. Number 4, it would be pro-poor. Many in the movement thought it should be socialist, but many did not. But all agreed that it should be pro-poor, from Dadabhai Naoroji down to Gandhi to the communists. Naoroji's first book is Poverty and Non-British Rule in India. You read R. Siddharth, you read Rana Day, you read Naoroji, any of the early nationalists. The focus of their writing is that colonialism must be opposed because it causes poverty. So the pro-poor orientation is very much there, which we must remind ourselves. And lastly, that the future India would be one which would be based on a modern scientific outlook, on reason, rationality, not on blind faith and obscurantism, what Jawaharlal Nehru called the scientific temper. It needs to be emphasized that these 5 core ideas, on these ideas, there was a consensus in the wide spectrum of the Indian national liberation struggle. A spectrum which, on the one hand, had liberals, to the other hand, communists, capitalists, Gandhians, I mean, every possible revolutionaries mode of thinking was represented on it. They had a lot of differences among themselves, but there was a consensus on all 5 of these points. The only people who did not agree with these core ideas, I mean, this consensus, as I said, remind ourselves that from Rana Day to Tilak to Bhagat Singh to Gandhi to Nehru to Bose to Acharya Narendra Dev to EMS Namudripat to Harkishan Singh Surjit to PC Joshi to Muzaffar Ahmad, everybody, there was a consensus on all these points that I raised, the 5 of them. The only people who did not agree with this were the communalists and other loyalists to the empire, that is, who were outside the nationalist spectrum. That is, it is not therefore surprising that these forces found it so difficult to accept the Indian constitution and even the national flag. They go about bandying the flag these days all over the place, but it took them 50 years to fly the Indian national flag, because they were not part of this, as I said, this core thinking of the national liberation struggle. In recent years, as state power or governmental power at the center and in many states has gone into the hands of those who follow the precepts of the communal strand, which remained outside, as I said, the spectrum of the national movement, most of the core ideas of the national liberation struggle are under threat today. And that's what is going to be the bulk of my talk. That where are we today in terms of these core ideas? I'd like to elaborate a bit what our nationalist leaders understood by some of the key constituents of these core ideas, which has been commonly called the idea of India. What did they think about it? First, let's look at, I want to particularly discuss 2 aspects, democracy and secularism in today's context. But others are equally important. I'll talk briefly about them also. But I want to elaborate how our nationalist leaders, our founding fathers, understood these two concepts. First, democracy. To them, democracy meant civil liberties, freedom of the press. This was from as early as 1820s, when Ramon Roy is talking of the freedom of the press, to Surendranath Banerjee talking about it in the 1880s, fighting for it, Tilak in the 1890s, Gandhiji in the 1920s, the last three of them, that is Banerjee, Tilak and Gandhiji, all jailed for fighting for the right to freedom of the press. All Tilak and Gandhiji charged for sedition under section 124A of the Indian Penal Code, the infamous colonial law brought in 1870 to repress the freedom of speech, which shockingly, as you are aware, is being used wantonly today to suppress the freedom. But this was considered from the early 19th century onwards as the central issue in democracy, the freedom of speech and civil liberties. Gandhiji, shortly before he was arrested and jailed in 1922, under the above section 124A, for sedition, for writing what he was writing at that time, he said the following. He asserts the seminal importance of civil liberties. He says, we must make good the right of free speech and free association. I will emphasize the second part also very soon. It's very important. Before we make any further progress towards our goal. So it is a first principle, first step. To accept defeat in the matter of free speech and free association is to court disaster. We must defend these elementary rights with our lives. So as far as Gandhiji is concerned, if you do not have these two, freedom of speech and freedom of association, you haven't even started your political task. He further explains, what does freedom of speech mean? Freedom of speech doesn't mean that you praise the current Maharaja. Liberty of speech means that it is unassailed even when the speech hurts. Liberty of the press can be said to be truly respected only when the press can comment on the severest terms and even misrepresent matters. Freedom of association, and this is very important, coming from Gandhiji, freedom of association is truly respected when assemblies of people can discuss even revolutionary projects. It is not for nothing that Lenin called Gandhi revolutionary. Lenin says he brought people into political action and did not prevent them from going further in a revolutionary direction. We have come a long way from this understanding of what democracy is. When journalists and stand-up comedians are picked up even before they have expressed themselves, where in today's India, holding protest meetings, as you would have discovered, I'm sure by now, has become almost impossible. You can't book a hall. They will ask, who are your invitees, what speech are you going to give, who will, etc., etc. You can't hold it in public. Even elected members of parliament and former cabinet ministers, as you witnessed just a few weeks ago, cannot lead a small demonstration because section 144 is immediately imposed and they're arrested. So what was during the colonial period the most important form of struggle, that is meetings and associations, public meetings, rallies, has become virtually impossible. So it's one of two of the most fundamental aspects of democracy, the freedom of speech and freedom of association, is seriously under threat today. Secondly, democracy to our nationalist leaders meant dialogue, as your organization and your series is called. It meant dissent. It meant respect for the opposition. I don't know how many of you know this, that right through the national movement, at critical junctures, whether it is the 42 movement or the launching of the first non-cooperation movement, things were put to vote openly. People would openly oppose each other, and it was encouraged. I'll give you the example, and it is probably one of the best examples I can recall, where during the Quit India movement, as you are aware, in 1942, the communist position had changed because the Soviet Union had got involved in the Second World War, and they now called it the People's War, and therefore did not want at that time the Allied to be weakened, and therefore India should not launch a movement at that time. That was the communist position in 1942. And when the Quit India speech is being given on 9th August in Bombay, that is when the movement starts, 13 communists get up and oppose it. Gandhiji gets up and he says, I admire these people. I don't have the quotation in front of me, but it's worth reading the exact words of it, where he says that the courage that they have to stand up for their position, irrespective of what however many people think otherwise, is what I would like to do for myself. That is, if I believe in something, even if I have to do it alone, I will go on. He was protecting these people because of the mass sort of upsurge at that time. The mood at that time was such that anybody who stood up against the Quit India movement at that point of time, when the country was virtually in fire, would face a lot of trouble. And Gandhiji protected them by asserting their right to dissent and have a different opinion. Right? So now this was the tradition. Nehru, of course, repeatedly talked about this, that there is no democracy unless there is dialogue and unless you respect the opposition. He was to repeatedly harp on this, and he led by example. I mean, he would bring the opposition into his own cabinet. Look at Nehru's first cabinet. People who were not congressmen, who hated the Congress, people like Shyama Prasad Mukherjee are also in the cabinet. Ambedkar is also there. So the question of not dealing with the opposition did not even arise. As he put it in 1950, Nehru is now talking at the peak of his popularity when he would have smothered any opposition. He says, I'm not afraid of the opposition in this country. I do not mind if the opposition groups grow. I do not want India to be a country in which millions of people say yes to one man. I want a strong opposition. Very presciently, he also said, this is too large a country with too many legitimate diversities to permit any so-called strong man to trample over people and their ideas. This alpha male, dabang, strong man, he was very critical of that. Unfortunately, this vision also has been thrown overboard. We now talk of mukti. We talk of opposition mukt Bharat, Congress mukt Bharat, Lutyens Delhi mukt Bharat, left liberal, all of you, mukt Bharat, Andolan Jeevi, Parjeevi, mukt Bharat, independent thinking universities like JNU mukt Bharat, NGOs mukt Bharat, Amnesty International India mukt Bharat, human rights organizations mukt Bharat. I mean, this is a complete travesty of what a democratic system is supposed to be. We come to the second critical element, and I want to again explain how the nationalists saw it. As I said earlier, that the Indian nationalists saw democracy and secularism as conjoint ideas. They use the phrases together, secular democracy, because you cannot have democracy without secularism, and you cannot be secular unless you're democratic. For the Indian nationalist, diversity, whether it be linguistic, ethnic, religious, or whatever, was not seen as a problem. It was to be celebrated. If you will allow me to quote once again the father of the nation, at a time when the admirers of his assassin do not move about furtively in dark, dingy lanes, but strut about in as elected members of the legislatures, circulate videos where they reenact the murder of the Mahatma. In such an atmosphere, if you will allow me, I would like to say how the first citizen of the country, how the father of the nation understood secularism. Again, coincidentally, on the 9th of August 1942, if you read what he writes in the Harijan, and I'm quoting from that, it was reported to Gandhiji that an organization, and you don't have to guess very hard to think of which one it is, that an organization in Delhi, after a daily lathi drill, they follow with the following slogan: Hindustan belongs to Hindus and to nobody else. And then this is followed by a brief discourse in which speakers say, drive out the English first and then we shall subjugate the Muslims. If they do not listen, we shall kill them. Now this was reported to Gandhiji, that this kind of statements are happening in Delhi, etc. So he immediately writes in the Harijan, and he says the following: the slogan is wrong and absurd. The slogan that Hindustan belongs to Hindus only, etc. Hindustan belongs to all those who are born and bred here and who have no other country to look to. I'm reading this out in slight detail because it's so relevant these days, when again issues of who's an Indian citizen, is being raised 75 years after independence. These issues were sorted out. We knew who was an Indian citizen. But now these issues are again being raised. So let me again reiterate what the Mahatma had to say about it. Hindustan belongs to all those who are born and bred here, who have no other country to look to. Therefore, it belongs to Parsis, Beni Israels, Indian Christians, Muslims. I mean, he names almost the smallest of communities that he can think of. And other non-Hindus as much as to Hindus. Free India will be no Hindu Raj. It will be Indian Raj based not on the majority of any religious sect or community, but on the representatives of the whole people without distinction of religion. Religion is a personal matter which should have no place in politics. I'm reiterating this because such propaganda is spread about Gandhiji that he brought religion into politics, this, that, and the other. Clear, explicit statement. It is in the unnatural condition of foreign domination that we have unnatural divisions according to religion. There is no force in the cry of driving out the English if the substitute is going to be Hindu or any other domination. That will be no Swaraj. The unthinkable a few decades ago, the unthinkable even, as I said, in the first election, Hindu Rashtra, the mirror image of Muslim Pakistan, is now being declared as the objective India must reach by people at the highest echelons of the political system, openly. This is again a big slide back. This was 20 years ago. Nobody would be, in a position to say this in the manner it is being said now. It is small wonder then that the world is no longer accepting India as a full democracy. However, we may beat our chest about it. India is said to be witnessing a democratic backsliding and is being variously described as a partially free democracy, a flawed democracy, and perhaps more appropriately, an electoral autocracy. And this is done by international bodies like the VDEM Institute of Sweden, the US-based Freedom House, the Economist's Economic Intelligence Unit, Democracy Index, and so on and so forth. Now, all these bodies are downgrading India on the democracy index because they give the reasons, because the current regime promotes anti-minority feelings and legislation. It violates human rights, and the diminishing of freedom of expression in the media and civil society has reached the peak. The reputed journal, The Economist, reported in May, as recently as May 19, 2022. It says, so that you know, I'm quoting from here because it should not be seen as the rantings of anti this or anti that. The Economist reported that Hindu nationalist, I would call it communalist, there is no such thing as Hindu nationalism. It's a contradiction in terms. How can you be a nationalist if you are only, if you are affiliated to only one religion in a multi-religious country? You can say Hindu anti-nationalist, or appropriately, as was done during the national liberation struggle, they were called communalists. Nobody ever called them nationalists, except themselves, of course. Hindu nationalist speakers at public rallies across northern India in recent years have launched bidding wars of threats against Muslims, from mass rape to mass expulsion. On May 7th, a BJP politician in Bihar in eastern India declared that Muslims should be burnt alive, just like the effigies of the Hindu demon Ravan. Hindu religious leaders linked with the Hindutva movement, without any fear of state intervention, have repeatedly talked of arming the Hindus and committing genocide of Muslims. You've heard the videos of these sadhus and sants. And the Economist reported, following a mini riot in Delhi in April 22, provoked once again by sword-waving youth, ostensibly leading a Hindu religious procession, menacing a mosque, a BJP leader, a well-known local BJP leader, quickly spun the events as a Muslim conspiracy. He said they should be identified, their houses should be bulldozed, he declared. A few hours later, this is the Economist again, bulldozers duly rolled in, smashing Muslim property for alleged building code violations. The bulldozer appears to have become the frightening imagery as well as the reality of punishing minorities. And this imagery is now again brazenly tom-tommed by political leaders. And one state says that we will outdo you in our bulldozers, bulldozer movement. The relentless, I may add here, you know what this Stanford anthropologist Thomas Hansen, the author of Law of Force, the violent heart of Indian politics, says. He talks of the license to kill Muslims and Dalits in India. He says that the message for all levels of government and police, that if you as a Hindu kill or attack a Muslim, you will not really be punished. That is what happened to Jews in Europe. They became fair game. So he's comparing the Hindu nationalist, Hindu communalist stormtroopers to the Nazi vigilant groups, that they have a virtual free pass on atrocities on certain sections of the communities who have been dehumanized. Again, a phrase which has been used by a Yale philosopher, the dehumanizing of sections of society in a manner that they become fair game for anybody who wants to destroy them. This relentless process of using traumatic events, real or imagined, from history in order to weaponize history to create a polarization between overwhelming religious majority on the one hand and the largest minorities is playing with fire. I mean, do remember the size of the minorities in India. The Muslims in India are approximately 200 million, Christians are 35 million, Sikhs 25 million. I mean, each one of them could constitute a small European country. Not small, but fairly important European country. This has the potential of leading to civil war-like situation. This polarization not only threatens to destroy the democratic structure, but threatens the very survival of the nation. It must be remembered that nation making is a historical process. It is not a preordained given event. It's a process. In fact, our nationalist leaders always talked about India, a nation in the making. That was the title of Surendranath Banerjee's book, India, a nation in the making. It's a process of you build a nation. And this process can be undone as well. And one doesn't have to go back too much in history to see such things happen, to see such reversals. The dismemberment of Yugoslavia in the 1990s and closer home, that of Pakistan in 1971 are two good examples of a nation being undone. Recently, it has been pointed out very, very well that how in Yugoslavia, a so-called memory of a 14th century battle where Muslim Turks had defeated Christian Serbs was drummed up, weaponized in a manner that in 1995, Srebrenica could happen, where 8,000 Bosnian Muslims were massacred. Srebrenica is still, I mean, if you visit there, you still see the graves. I mean, it is almost like a pilgrimage against mass genocide. Weaponizing the so-called memory of Muslim tyranny in India can lead to a similar denouement. An imagined memory of the deep psychological assault to the Hindu psyche made by, for example, the destruction of the Somnath temple is being spread in a manner that it actually becomes a memory. Whereas if you read history, for example, Professor Ramila Thapar has written a whole book on the Somnath, where she has demonstrated that 150 years after the destruction of the temple, another Hindu king rebuilt the temple, and he doesn't even mention Mahmud of Ghazni, the destruction of the previous temple. And 250 years later, and this is an 11th century phenomenon, 250 years later, in that area, the precincts of the Somnath temple, a mosque is being allowed to be built by the local community, the temple authorities, and the local ruler. And in other words, there is no deep psychological break in the minds of the Hindus and the Muslims. These were seen as, in the medieval times, any ruler, any king coming, cutting across religion, destroying each other's temples mainly for the riches that they contained, etc. What I'm trying to say is that this imagined memory and creating a reality out of that, this constant harping of what happened in Somnath, what did Aurangzeb do, etc., is then weaponized to currently do something much more barbarous than what was done earlier. Srebrenica happened. The demolition of the Babri Masjid happened. Again, these are memories, so-called, imagined memories of where who was born and etc. and whatnot. Faith and memory are being weaponized. This is dangerous business. Dangerous business because it threatens the survival of the state. Another chilling thought, which I just discovered in a conference on weaponizing history that was held in Italy, in Turin, and people from the world over were talking about how in their particular country, whether it's Turkey or Russia or India, etc., history is being weaponized for current political purposes. And a scholar who dare not make a frontal political statement for obvious reasons in that country, that is a Turkish scholar. As you know, many of their scholars have had to now run away from the country and migrate to the West. Read a paper where she said she talked about ancient, medieval, and early periods, so that no feathers would be ruffled, and talked about how names are changed. How names are changed, how certain names are erased, etc. And at the end of it comes to the conclusion, and she was talking about how the Armenian names were slowly dropped, how you erase a community from your memory, from your real life, from your people who were your neighbors, who you knew, who you understood, whose names you understood, suddenly do not exist anymore. And then she said that how this has everywhere, a genocide has been preceded by such erasure of names and memories. So it's a very chilling thought when you see the manner in which names are being just changed. Even a Muslim sounding name should not be there. It did not have anything Muslim about it. Even that should not be there. So, it is a very chilling thought that genocides are normally preceded by things like this. Coming back to the other core ideas very briefly. As for the pro-poor vision of the idea of India, the less said today, the better. The level of inequality that has been allowed to grow in India has reached, for lack of a better word, obscene levels. While we thump our chests, boasting the number of billionaires in India, the country keeps dropping in the hunger index to sub-Saharan levels. That our intelligentsia, our middle class should be oblivious of this fact, that our hunger index is reaching sub-Saharan levels, is really, really disturbing. A country where nearly half our children suffer from malnutrition. And we keep talking about becoming Vishwaguru. The images of bodies floating in the Ganga because of the fact that the wretched poor could not even do the last rites of their dear ones, or of migrant workers walking thousands of miles at 45 degrees centigrade, dragging their old, their poor, their children, their sick along. I mean, it has shocked the world that this could be allowed to happen. So the pro-poor vision has been abandoned completely. They do not exist. Erase them from, just as the minorities need to be erased, the poor, the notion of the poor needs to be erased. Similarly, the scientific temper is also on vacation. Our tallest leaders go about mixing up mythology and faith with science and history, inaugurating probably the most important scientific congress. The tallest of our leaders can say that we knew plastic surgery in ancient India, otherwise how did Ganesha get his elephant snout? A governor of a state who's now been elevated even further up, actually said in an engineering fair that Arjun of Mahabharata had actually nuclear tipped arrows. This has made us not great scientific nation. It has made us the laughing stock of the world. How does one resist this situation? It's not a coup. It's not a military overthrow, but an electoral majority route that has been taken to gradually undo our democracy. undo our civilization, undo our democracy, undo the idea of India. In a powerful book, How Democracies Die, Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, written in 2018, they say, I'm quoting, the tragic paradox of the electoral route to authoritarianism is that democracy's assassins use the very institutions of democracy gradually, subtly, and even legally to kill it. Now, that is what we are witnessing today. Levitsky further says, he gives examples. He says, packing and weaponizing the courts and other neutral agencies. You can add ED, CBI, whatever, etc. you want to it. Universities. Buying off the media and the private sector or bullying them. I mean, it sounds so familiar. India is witnessing today this process of an electoral majority being used to destroy the democratic institutions and the basic structure of India's democracy. So unless we stand up for it, unless we remind ourselves that freedom is not divisible, that is, unless we stand up for the freedom of the other, we will lose our freedom too. We have to stand up for the minorities. We have to stand up for the Bilkis Banos. We have to stand up for Kashmir. We have to stand up for the Dalit boy beaten to death because he takes water from his teacher's utensil. And not wait till our turn comes. That is why the German pastor Niemöller's Holocaust poem Never Dies, where he said, this is in the Stuttgart Declaration, when he was looking at what did the church not do, what was wrong, how did he allow Hitler to come to power? And he wrote this piece where he said that first they came for the Jews, and I did not speak up because I was not a Jew. Then they came for the communists, and I didn't speak up because I was not a communist. Then they came for the trade union workers, and I did not speak up because I was not a trade union worker. And then he says, when they finally came for me, there was nobody left to speak up. Now, I think that there is much repeated, but it's worth repeating. There is much in this, that one cannot wait endlessly till your personal rights are infringed upon. It is bound to happen. Unless you protect the other, you cannot be protected. Today, unfortunately, the days of just one second. Gandhi, the days of Gandhi and Nehru, who led from the front, who staked their life to protect the minorities in India. Those days are gone. No political leader does that. Lead from the front, as Gandhiji did. His last fast was to insist that the Muslims who have been thrown out of their houses in Delhi must be brought back, their mosques rebuilt, otherwise I'll die. This is leading from the front. Now, this is not happening. It no longer looks like the country our freedom fighters fought for. The values of the national movement are being violated wantonly without the political process taking note. Often the political parties are worried that they will lose the majority vote because society is already communalized if they spoke up for the minorities. And there's one reason, as you find, that even if there is a defense, it is often very muted. That's not the way. That's not the way even the democratic system can be saved. Yet, all is not lost. I think our people, our youth, our women have demonstrated their capacity to resist. In the recent past, the CAA agitation, for example, which clearly targeted the citizenship right of the minorities, was resisted by the youth, and not only by the minority youth, far from it, and by women all over the country. And the people who were resisting it very significantly were using the Constitution of India as their Bible. And they held aloft portraits of Gandhi, Bhagat Singh, Nehru, and Ambedkar. This movement, of course, was put down, as you know, brutally, using the COVID situation and by instigating communal riots. But shortly after that, we had the farmers' movement again. And as they did during the national liberation struggle, the Indian peasants demonstrated their capacity to resist the government despite tremendous repression over a long period of time. I mean, this was a movement which was absolutely worth watching. That is, they were put to untold sufferings, and they did not flinch until victory was achieved and the farm laws were withdrawn. But apart from these, we also have numerous civil society initiatives all over the country. And I think each one of them must be respected, and one must give them their due weight. The Constitutional Contact Group, for example, consisting of, people laugh at it, so what did you do when you were in service? This group consists of large number of very senior former civil servants, ambassadors, former secretaries, former heads of the armed forces, etc., who have strongly come out with statements critiquing the government for straying from the democratic path guaranteed by the Constitution. I think it's important that people of that kind have also spoken up. There are still independent media portals. There are some newspapers, individual journalists, bodies of intellectuals like yours, writers, actors, stand-up comedians, musicians, historians, human rights activists. They've continued to resist despite facing severe repression by the state machinery. So all hope is not lost. The hope is that the political parties, the opposition political parties, will be able to guide and take forward this resistance that is emerging in society, that exists in society. That is what leadership is all about. That is why Gandhi was accepted as a leader by everybody else. He said, Gandhi repeatedly said, I do not create movements. I see the movement on the ground and I am able to grasp the movement and give it a direction. That is what is required, in my opinion, today. Grasp this, the energy that is there, that in resisting what is happening, and take it forward by the political process. The political process has to be involved. The opposition political parties will have to remember the critical lesson learned from the history of fascism in Europe. That to resist fascism, one needs to unite all forces that are opposed to fascism and believe in democracy. They have to put aside their internal differences. The anti-fascist forces, whatever be their internal differences, have to be put aside. It is not any longer a fight between the left and the right, or between various shades of the left or the various shades of the right. It's a fight between saving one of the greatest achievements of human civilization, democracy and civil liberty, from fear hatred, and barbarism. A lesson, unfortunately, it appears to me, our political system has not fully internalized yet. Though there are certain indications that this, this recognition is growing, but one can only hope that this recognition comes and all anti-fascist forces are able to join hands and save this country from what appears to be the gravest danger that it has ever faced since independence. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for this great summarizing of what 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 we have been losing with this ascent of the right-wing forces at the center, and what needs to be done. The manner in which you made clear today there is a great fashion that people loosely use the word Hindu nationalism. So I think many aspects of the whole battle which lies ahead, you have made clear how the weaponizing of memory is being done and what are the challenges before us. So before I invite any question from the chat box, I will request our senior comrade Ravi to say a few words and start the discussion. Ravi.
Thank you, Subhash, and thank you so much, Aditya Sahab, for this magnificent, lucid, very inspiring talk, a very insightful summary of what kind of situation we are in. While Subhash and Bhargav pick up questions from the chat box or from the audience, and there are many eminent names in the audience I see, I just get this opportunity to kickstart the discussion. So obviously I am absolutely, I have nothing to really to ask or say after such a masterful presentation. But to start the discussion, I would be curious to know how would you see that if, as you say, if there are no deep-seated fault lines in mind, let us say, and if they have succeeded, as in many other examples and many other countries that you mentioned, if they have succeeded by relentlessly sort of spreading the poisonous ideology and propaganda, then the question still remains that why do they succeed so easily? I mean, they haven't succeeded so easily, I realize, but still, why have they succeeded in turning the democracy into, as you pointed out, in an electoral autocracy? Is it that the political agents of the good kind, if they are very effective and they are active, then democracy will survive, secularism will survive. And if the malignant forces become very active, then it will not. Is it just that? Or is it also that the social mind and other aspects of the social political climate, the society itself, gets implicated in making it difficult for some political forces and making it easier for some other political forces? Because this question will also be important for what kind of strategies we can come up with in order to resist. So my curiosity to start the discussion will be about the relationship between political agency and the social fault lines or social climate or social mind. Which one is to be underlined how much, and how this interaction goes on? Do we blame the inactivity or insufficiency or weaknesses of the good forces for the predicament we are in? or somehow as democracy became entrenched in our society, something that was deeply hidden in our social mind, that was kind of pulled out into the political arena by the dynamics of competitive electoral democracy. So somebody was going to come along and appeal to Hindus also should be given a rashtra, because Muslims got a rashtra and many other religions got a rashtra. So the traction of this Hindu rashtra, do we see mostly on their propaganda and their political activity, or do we see that existing in the fault lines of our society itself? Thank you.
Very, very good, profound question. If there is a fault line in India, it is a fault line of having a civilizational value where we have for centuries learned to live with each other. If there is something which is the legacy, what is being done is to undo that. There is no fault line. As I just now gave you the example of Somnath itself. People did not, and which Mughal or Muslim ruler did not have, as their generals Hindus, and vice versa? Which major Hindu king did not have Muslims as his generals and his ministers? And it was not an issue. It has been made into an issue since the late 19th century. It's a very conscious attempt to create identities where none existed of the kind. There was no such thing as the word Hindu did not exist, till late medieval period, right? So there were different identities, but this notion of a religious identities overriding all other identities is what the heart of communalism is all about. That if you are a Hindu or a Muslim, then your political, economic, cultural, linguistic interests also are very different from the other. Now, this is not a fact. We know it is not a fact. There is nothing in common between a Muslim landlord and a Muslim his servant, his landless laborer. There is nothing in common between a Tamil fisherman and the Muslim Tamil fisherman and the Muslim Nawab of Rampur. There is nothing, either language or dress or food or nothing. But it is an effort to create this community, and the failure to combat that which has led to the current situation. So I don't think this is an existing fault line that they're picking up. You can invent memories. You see, even where there none exist. As I said, that the Somnath is such a great example that it is only in the 19th century in the British Parliament that the first time the issue of Somnath was raised as something which hurt the Hindu psyche. The word was not used before that, ever, in no historical writing for 10 centuries. And then from there it is picked up by the Hindu communalists, and they repeatedly say that Somnath completely singed the Hindu psyche and permanently divided for 1,000 years the Hindus and the Muslims. They were not divided for 1,000 years. Even the 1911 census by the British, 1911 census, early 20th century, cites thousands of people. When they're asked, what is your religion? They said that I am a Hindu Sikh, or I am a Hindu Mohammedan, or I am a Mohammedan Hindu. This is in the Bombay presidency. I'm just giving you some examples. People even today, it is particularly between the Sikhs and the Hindus, for example, this was the census. It was forced upon them to choose one or the other. The British census authorities insisted, no, you cannot say you are a Hindu Sikh or a Sikh Hindu. You have to say either you are a Hindu or you are a Sikh. So identities can be developed over time which did not exist. And as I said, memories of trauma can be created, built upon, and weaponized. Look at what is being attempted today. While celebrating independence, what is being talked about is the 14th of August, the partition, the terror, the killings, etc. Now, everybody who has studied it, Ashish Nandi was one of the first to point this out, that if you were to actually count the number of Muslims who protected the Hindus and the number of Hindus who protected the Muslims during the partition, their numbers would be, in exponentially higher than those who actually attacked each other. You see? But are we talking about that? I mean, if you visit Pakistan, for example, which I have, I mean, almost any visitor has always said, "यार यहाँ तो कोई फर्क ही नहीं होता, वो तो तुम्हें they do jappi to you, and they give you free food, they give you free." This has happened to us also in Lahore, etc. So it is not as if there is a fault line there, but a fault line has been created. Now your question is that why have they succeeded? I think partially because the RSS, for example, after it was banned and they were allowed to come out of the ban only on the assurance that they were a cultural organization, that they were not a political organization. They made that assurance. What they did was they focused on ideology, on spreading communal poison from school textbook onwards. For decades and decades and decades they did it. From the 1950s, from one Shishu Niketan or whatever they call their RSS schools, to thousands of them now. There are lakhs of students going to these schools, picking up poison, pure poison, where it is said that wherever Muslims go, they go with sword in one hand. I'm quoting from an RSS textbook for 9-year-olds. They go sword in one hand and Quran in the other. Rivers of blood flow. Temples are destroyed, libraries are burnt, and mothers and sisters are humiliated. Who are saying this? Who demolished the Babri Masjid? Who burnt the Bhandarkar library? Who humiliated mothers and sisters in Gujarat in 2002? But the image created through these books is that the demon is the Muslim. And the young boy who grows up reading that, when he kills a Muslim, he thinks, wow, what a great act I have committed. Now, the fault was that despite warnings, and we have been warning at least for 25 years on this, as intellectuals, as historians, that this must be combated at the ideological level. No civilized society, not even the United States anymore, allows children to study racism in their textbooks. It used to be a debate in the United States that why not? But now it is not permitted. But in our country, a democracy of 75 years, even now, you can teach the worst form of racism about communities. Like, for example, how are Christians described in RSS textbooks? We have written about it. The book that Subhash mentioned has long quotations from this. Christians are anti-national. It is they who are responsible for the partition of the country. And even today, Christians and they name the states where they are, in Bihar, in Goa, in this, that, and the other. They are, very dangerous elements which can break up the country. It is being taught in school textbooks that Hitler was a great man, and look what he did to the Jews, and we should learn from that. Now, if you allow that, and you see, the tendency was, and this was, from the Nehruvian days, there was a certain amount of economism. That is, economic growth. The temples of modern India shall be the IITs and IIMs and the steel mills and the dams, etc. And all this rubbish sort of obscurantist thing will die out. It doesn't die out unless you combat it. Now, there hasn't been an ideological combat of this kind of poison, A. And B, as you correctly said, that this was just waiting to happen. In a situation of stress, poverty, or want, picking up of an identity for mobilizing is what has been done globally everywhere. So how come that we were not aware of this? Correct. The only way you can fight narrow identities is with a larger identity, which is what was done during the national movement. The national identity. Nationalism had to be accepted. It had to be given a different meaning. As I said, our forefathers tried to give it a meaning. When they said Swaraj, the question kept being asked is Swaraj for whom? And then the answer would keep growing, Swaraj for the working class. And nationalist leaders like Tilak, Lala Lajpat Rai and C.R. Das formed the ITUC, All India Trade Union Congress in 1920, not the communists and socialists. So already there is this notion ki Swaraj for whom? Swaraj for the peasants. The Kisan Sabhas are formed. Swaraj for the Dalits. The anti-untouchability movements are there. So this notion of a nation has to be there and a pride in that nation. What we did was we demolished this idea. If you want to see a critique of Indian nationalism, you don't have to read the RSS, etc. You read the literature. Unfortunately, largely that used to emanate from the left, which demonizes Gandhi, calls him a bourgeois representative, which demonizes Tilak, saying कि ये तो Hindu राष्ट्र कर रहे थे, etc., etc. We gave them up. We gave up our great national liberation struggle and handed it over to the right to ride on. So we have to own it up. We have to fight the narrower identities with a bigger identity, a more humane identity, a more, and it is wrong to say that human beings are programmed to be bad. They're programmed to be good. If there is a fault line, as I said, the fault line is that people want to be good. But let us offer them something good. Offer them an identity which elevates them. But we are not, because there is no ideological battle. We do trade unions, we do revolution in those kinds of areas. But where is the ideological work? If there are so many RSS schools, where are at least in the 60s and 70s, there used to be Marx clubs. They have all disappeared. Where, tell me, in which political party across the spectrum is doing counter-ideological work at the grassroots? Nobody. The only ideological party left in this country is the BJP, and therefore they succeed.
Thank you. Then I will request Comrade Bhargav to share the questions in the chat box. And others also can add their questions in the chat box, or they can raise their hands. Please, Bhargav, please.
Yeah, thank you, Subhash. Thank you very much, Professor Mukherjee, and for a beautiful and insightful and very inspiring lecture. There are a few questions in chat box, and I'll take them. The one question posed by Anil Sadgopalji, I am relaying that question to you. Is anti-caste movement from mid-19th century preceding anti-imperialist movement not part of the national liberation movement? Have Phule's, Jyotiba Phule's, Ayati Das, Sahuji Maharaj, Periyar and Ambedkar and their contribution to envisioning an universal, equitable and democratic education system with social justice not contributed to the idea of India and the making of the Constitution? Why is your otherwise lucid, enlightening and inspiring discourse today was without any reference to this significant dimension of our history? That's a question he asked.
Yeah, I mean, there is absolutely no doubt that the social movements, the anti-caste movements, were very much part of the national liberation struggle. And in fact, they preceded, I mean, the so-called Renaissance, the Bengal Renaissance, for example, and which happened not only in Bengal, in Maharashtra, in several parts of the country, in South India particularly, did take up first these issues, often first the issues of caste, etc. The rights of women, the struggle against caste oppression. And mind you, the struggle against caste oppression doesn't start only in the 19th century. I would see it starting with the Buddha. I mean, there has been organically in our society a struggle against caste oppression through the Bhakti movement, through the Sufi movements, etc. That these differences that we had in caste and religious differences were sought to be ameliorated through movements, and it is that process which got broken by the imperial intervention. That is, it froze the existing differences and then exaggerated them even further. So I could not agree with you more that these were very much part of national liberation. And again, if I may go back to the father of the nation, he was one of the first to recognize this. From his South Africa days, he hits at the worst elements of caste oppression, that is cleaning other people's refuse, and he starts doing it himself and yet makes people in the ashram to do that, including his wife, etc. So what I'm trying to say is that it is not as if this is not part of the movement, and of course this is not to undermine Ambedkar or Phule or anybody else. They are all part of this movement and they were seen as such despite differences of opinion. Do remember that it is at Gandhiji's insistence that Ambedkar is made the chairman of the drafting committee. It was not necessary. I mean, the constitution was virtually written already in the 1930 Karachi resolution and over time by the stalwarts of the freedom struggle. But it was an effort to take everybody along. Gandhi and Ambedkar did have different understanding of how to deal with the caste situation, and I think we have far too much created a binary between them. You see both in Ambedkar's writing and in Gandhi's writing an appreciation of each other as well, and I would rather look at that. And I mean, I hope you do not go away with the feeling that I am only representing the upper caste Hindu national movement. There was no such thing. I mean, there were upper castes in this was essentially the imperialist idea that Indian nationalism is nothing but the Chitpavan Brahmins and the Kulin Brahmins fighting for their upper caste precepts. But that was not the reality. That was not the reality.
We have with us Professor Swadesh Mahajan, and I will request him to join the discussion. Swadesh, please.
Thank you for asking me to make a minor contribution. And it's a great privilege to have one of my children, Aditya Mukherjee, give such a beautiful and wonderful lecture. And since we have talked over the years so many times about so many issues, it will be somewhat strange for me to ask him a question, but I would do something in that ballpark. Now, I would like to agree with your whole description that the creation of Hindu nationalism is really a deliberate phenomena. And for a large time in our history, the Hindus and Muslims learned to live together. But at the same time, it will be perhaps not wise to forget that the communities which live together for so long, it's not that they have gone beyond their differences. They live together despite their differences because it's good, it's convenient, it's human. But every time you have in the atmosphere a group of people like Nehru, Gandhi, etc., they tend to minimize your tendencies toward the so-called evil and poison, because their very presence and their stature basically makes you feel ashamed when you have feelings which seem to run against the culture. So I would say that problems between Hindus and Muslims, it's not that they were non-existent, but it was very embarrassing, shameful to really dwell on them, and even more so to act on them. So when constraints like this to some extent were relaxed, and the leadership basically became encouraging those tendencies and spreading that poison, it became very natural for them to have that so-called some pent-up emotions which were there all the time, to some degree, suppressed, not expressible, non-manifest, right? But it's not that they had disappeared altogether. And they never do. And in no communities that they ever do. So in some sense, we cannot give a clean bill that it's only they who constructed this entire narrative. And we have become, to some extent, victims of that. I think we have to examine on what basis they could exploit. What are the kind of things that they could learn, and what exactly, to some extent, we can do today to make sure that such fault lines, which might appear not to be so historical and so important, really do not allow BJPs and RSS to exploit them to this ruthless extent. I mean, Modi's popularity is just so stupendous that it's very difficult to believe that some kind of an fertility for his ideas to take off did not exist. It's just like saying that some German scientist came to United States and the new scientific revolution came. No, I mean, United States was already very fertile. It did need some new seeds, some cultivation to do that. So I think in some sense, we have to examine that also very seriously and meticulously.
Yeah. I see what you're saying, and it somewhat resonates with what I think Ravi was also saying, that there is a tendency of the fault line theory in this, that there must have been something, otherwise how could it be? But I mean, I can give you a completely different story of the region that you are most familiar with, out of which you have emerged, the Punjab. I mean, if you look at the last 800-year history of its culture, its music, its language, and and in the manner in which people forgot those differences. I mean, from Baba Farid to Bulle Shah to Laila Majnu. I mean, who the hell knows whether Laila Majnu are Hindu or Muslim? I mean, I ask people, they don't know. But issues would not arise, and the language distinction disappeared, and so many other Of course, this is not to say that the Hindus became Muslims and Muslims became Hindus. No, they were two distinct communities, but they learned to live together in a manner that there was no reason at all that what we have witnessed, the kind of killings and partition that we witnessed, happened. As you know, that it was not in the region of the Punjab which actually became Pakistan that communalism happened. It was only in the last few years. Communalism was very much a phenomenon of that emerged in the UP region, not in Punjab in that sense. So, there are these Magnihars, for example, of Rajasthan. The bards who sing the genealogies of families. Now they sing the genealogies of Hindu families, and they are almost all, to the last person, they are all Muslims. So once they became famous globally because the French discovered them, that the music that they evolved is an amazing mixture of classical and folk music that the Rajasthani Mangniyars have evolved, and it has become a global phenomenon. So once it became so, we all got interested and started speaking to them. And I remember interviewing a very old exponent of this bard and asking him that, Khan Saab the ab naam punja bhul gaya, ki how come that almost every song that you sing is about Kailash, about Krishna, about this, about that, and you are a Muslim. So he looked so flabbergasted. He said, "What kind of a question is this?" He says, "मेरे बाप भी गाता था, मेरे परदादा भी गाता था, मैं भी गाता हूँ." But the thought had not occurred in his mind that he, as a Muslim, cannot be singing, to the village folk, the musical tradition of the alternate religion. So what I'm trying to say is that a lot of it is created. A lot of it is created It did not. If it existed, so I could ask the counter question that if there was a fault line, then how come till 1947, till the partition riots, the Hindu communalists got virtually no percentage from the Hindus? The overwhelming majority of the Hindus were with the Congress. And I told you the first general election result. The Hindu Mahasabha, the Ram Rajya Parishad, etc., all put together got 9 seats out of 486. They got 6% of the votes. The overwhelming, how come the overwhelming Indian people did not, despite the provocation of the riots and the killings, etc., they did not vote for Hindu Rashtra? So obviously, it is not as if that there is a given fault line. If, as I said, if there is a given fault line, it is the other way around. That we had evolved historically amazing ways of living together, and which is what I think nobody gives a word to better than Jawaharlal Nehru in his discovery of India. I mean, it's everything, from the Greeks to the Parthians to the Turks to the Afghans, everything has gone through the region of northwestern India. And as he said, like a palimpsest, where one layer falls upon the other without destroying the earlier one, leaving the marks of it, absorbing it, and forming another layer. That was the beauty of our civilization. And we need to bring it to our people. That is the beauty, and that's what we need to be proud of, as at least the generation young people used to be proud of. And the Sanghis, as we used to call them, used to hide in the woodwork. Now, what is it that has allowed them to come out of the woodwork? That is what we have to question. And I think the answer to that is not that there must have been something wrong. How can there be a fire without, smoke without a fire? I don't buy that argument. You can sometimes create a fire where there need not have been a fire.
So if I may just say one word, I don't believe that you are refining the fault line a bit too much. The fault line is not something which either exists or it does not exist. Okay. The question is there a potential for a fault line? Is it possible to create a fault line? And,
I agree there.
And can that fault line go unstable? All right. The stability or instability of that fault line depends upon various conditions, what you can call the equilibrium with the Hindus and the Muslims had established. And unfortunately, the conclusion of the whole thing is that an instability was possible if there were forces sufficiently united to excite it. All right. So the point is that it's not really to some extent a given of the system. It could have stayed in this position of semi-equilibrium forever. And as you very correctly pointed out, that there were all things being done across the communities. Even in the Hindi film, you have a song, Man Tadpat Haridarshan Ko Aaj, written by a Muslim, sung by a Muslim, set to music by a Muslim, right? I mean, so in some sense, these cultural things are always there. My worry is that by emphasizing the fact that there was no potential or no manifest potential of a fault line, perhaps we'll be misguiding ourselves.
No,
we have to be cognizant of that.
I totally take the second point that you're making, that one must be very watchful of the possibility of picking on fault lines or creating fault lines where none exist. There is no doubt about it. And that is what I think I was trying to say, that is what the national movement tried to do.
I agree with that. I agree.
Provide a counter ideology. That is, a nation class identity was being offered as an alternative to religion caste.
Exactly.
The imperial state provided religion caste as the identity that should be promoted because it suited them, because it divided the Indian people. And it was picked up by caste movements and by communal movements, often under imperial tutelage. Whereas what was needed was a wider identity. And what I think happened after independence is that we gave up that struggle, thinking that now that the Brits are gone, and in fact, Nehru, in fact, even says this, that once the third party goes, things will become all right. But it doesn't.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't.
Unless conscious ideological battle is maintained, and to our great horror, it has not even started.
Yeah.
You know, where is the conscious counter ideological battle against communal ideology? Where? Who? Except among the literary people. The only people who fought this battle, I would say, are people in the literary sphere.
Yes.
You know, in an
No,
amazing way.
this is something which is very difficult to understand. Why aren't we rising en masse? Somewhere, something is happening. Why are there no Dandi marches taking place? Why aren't people doing all kinds of things which are absolutely essential to combat this poison? Right. They're all together on that.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Sudesh.
So, Ravi, you want to add something, or you're saying something? You raise your hand? No, sorry. Bhargav, please take up question.
Yeah. I will read. There is a question in the chat box by Mr. Anand. Yes, ours has been a great successful experiment in political democracy, but it has following well-known structural limitations. One, first past system in elections. Congress and BJP got 100% cabinet seats with 35% of votes. Second, no right to recall. Third, unaccountable bureaucracy. Four, no entry to democracy inside factories and farms. Five, fundamental rights do not include right to employment, health, etc. The current usurpation of political democracy by BJP is partly due to these limitations, because of which socio-economic well-being of people remained a dream. Can we win back political democracy without including these guiding principles as fundamental rights, whether the Congress will agree to it or not?
I couldn't agree. I agree with almost everything that has been said, except to point out that it is not true that people haven't fought for this. In fact, what you have witnessed in the last 25, 30 years, on the one hand, is this negative growth of communalism. But on the other hand, we have witnessed the amazing success, I would say, of rights-based movements. Right to employment, right to food, right to education, these movements, and they have emerged from the bottom. They have emerged from and have led to, in fact, the state having to even pass laws in that and amend the constitution on that basis. So I think these have been some victories, but I am totally with you that those rights-based movements are critical part of a democracy, a survival of a democracy. But that there are structural issues like the one you mentioned, the first past the post system, that there are a lot of people who have said that it needs to be relooked at. But how is the question? I don't know. I don't have an answer, because the political parties do not seem to be wanting to do that. But there is absolutely, I think almost all experts have agreed on this, that certain electoral reforms are very much on the cards, and this is one of them, undoubtedly so. Yeah.
Rahul had raised his hand in the chat box. He raised his hand. Rahul, Mr. Rahul, can you unmute yourself and raise your question? Rahul. I think Rahul is not out here. We have with us Mr. Rajiuddin. He is the scientist. Oh, are you saying something? Okay, sorry. Rahul, you are not audible. No, you are not audible. Yeah. We have with us Mr. Rajiuddin is a scientist at the Washington DC National Institute of Health, and I will request him to share his comment and query. Mr. Rajiuddin, please unmute yourself. Bhargav, please take up another question in the chat box.
Yeah, let's take up. In fact, there is a two questions somewhat related. One is a brief question by Madhavi, and another question from Padma. For example, Madhavi asked, how did we go wrong to reach this? Where did we go wrong to reach this sorry state of affairs? When given the background of great national movement and the initial beginning of decolonization and building democratic structures, keeping that in view, where did we go wrong to reach this sorry state? And Padma, in another question, she asked, uh, uh, why Saraswati Shishu Mandirs and madrasas not banned after 10 years of independence? How secular India gets its root if these things are allowed? So these are the two questions.
Yeah, these are both Madhvi and Padma. I think your questions are very legitimate and they're correct questions. And these are the questions that are bothering us. That why is it, why is it allowed? And it is nothing new. It is since 77. In 1977, for the first time, when the RSS came close to state power, because they joined, as you know, the Janata Party, they started attacking secular social science books, secular history books. They attacked. They wanted to ban Ramila Thapar and Bipin Chandra, Satish Chandra, etc. From then onwards. And so what one was aware from the 1950s, as you said, that there was this effort to spread this poison. But I think it was hubris. It was this overconfidence that, we are moving forward in this rapid way. And these are sort of the lunatic fringe, as we used to ourselves. I remember in my school and college days, look upon them as the lunatic fringe. Nobody took them seriously. But that was the mistake. That we were, in fact, I would say it is the failure of the Indian elite, that it was only looking at itself. It was not seeing what was happening at the grassroots, what is happening in the village schools. We did not look at that. What is the education system? Who's been worrying about it? What is the content of the education system? Many educationists have pointed out that it is not only a question of reach, it is a question of what is being reached to the people. But the inaction of the political forces, the secular, and across the board, mind you, communalism is not as if it is there only in the Congress-led states. There are states where the communists have ruled for 25 years at a stretch. What has been the counter effort at the grassroots, at the education level? It is amazingly poor. You would be shocked to see the textbooks in Bengal, often resembling that go around in Uttar Pradesh. So it has been amnesia of sorts. But the fact that one didn't wake up even after 2002 is what is amazing. What shocks me is that after 2002, after it was evident that these forces can come to political power at the center and can cause huge destruction to the idea of India, what did we do for 10 years when, from 2004 to 14, when they were not in power? What combined effort, what energy was demonstrated in trying to combat it? I think we really asked for it. You cannot combat forces as powerful as these communal fascist forces with namby-pamby measures. I think the war hasn't even been taken on as yet, unfortunately. And that's why we are in the current denouement.
Thank you. Another question from Anant again. In 21st century, can political democracy in India thrive by being limited to the Nehruvian framework? Is it not necessary to go beyond it so that socio-economic problems of people are addressed properly? Would not that require a huge dose of accountability of the political and administrative bureaucracy?
Would it not require what? Last part?
Would not that require huge dose of accountability of the political and administrative bureaucracy?
Of course. Of course, there is absolutely no doubt, and Nehru would have been the last person to say that he had all the answers and that you need not go further. And in fact, since you mentioned Nehru, one of his last thoughts was that one of the big mistakes he made was he thought that he could bring about social change through the bureaucracy. Rather, because he was not unable, like Mahatma Gandhi, to do it politically, but he did try to transform India through the bureaucracy in a very big way, through the public sector, through the education system, etc., etc. But bureaucracies are bureaucracies. After a point, they feed themselves. They cannot be the answer. The answer needs to be political. And, you are absolutely right, and that Nehru would agree with everybody, with you as much, that the answer really politics at the grassroots level. There is no other way democracy can be widened or deepened.
So when do we start a new set of schools?
Day before yesterday. It's too late.
No, but we can't be too late. We can't afford to be too late.
Like universities were started, the JNU was started specifically with this purpose of creating a secular, pro-poor, equitous institution which would be independent. Of course, it has been destroyed, but or it is in the process of being destroyed. But we needed 100 JNUs.
Yes, and 100,000 schools.
And we don't
100,000 schools.
Yeah, you're right, and we don't even have one.
Yeah. And why aren't old folks like us doing it?
Starting a school? Good idea. Some of them have, but I said that unless it is taken up politically, there are the Amartya Sens and the Gayatri Spivaks who have opened schools in their villages, etc., where I'm sure very nice education does happen. There are many NGOs who are doing it at various levels, very good work. But it is not an NGO activity which will transform. No. It has to be taken on politically. That is why Gandhiji was so relevant. When in the 1920s, he brings the issue of caste and untouchability bang into the national movement. He says you cannot be a member of the Congress unless you believe in Hindu-Muslim unity and you are against untouchability. So it has to be part of the politics.
If Bhargav picks up another question from the chat box, before that, could I get a second chance to bring into Professor Mukherjee? I saw Professor Mukherjee and Professor Mridula Mukherjee in a photograph in which they were sitting behind a well-known leader of Congress party, and the impression I got was that they were participating in the movement of civil society organizations called by that party. So, if it is not too improper, can you say a few words about what is happening in the electoral political struggle, and how things are being thought about people who matter a order of magnitude more than we do?
We were there only as an observer and as part of the civil society groups. This was a meeting, to make it clear, which Rahul Gandhi had called to meet various civil society groups, over 100 of them from all over the country, in preparation for the Bharat Jodo Yatra, that is to start from the south of India and going up to the north, right? And his stated position was that this is, while it is being promoted by the Congress party, it is not a party program. They will not carry the party flag, they will carry the national flag, and it is open to and must involve and which is what I thought was the positive part of it, must involve every shade of political opinion which believes in Bharat Jodo, right? And particularly the various NGOs. So at that meeting, there were various NGOs who spoke up, and they expressed the same feeling. They said, whether you do it or not, whether you do it badly or not, we are going to participate in that movement. Now, if this Bharat Jodo Yatra kind of thing can be operationalized, it's a massive effort. If it can actually invigorate enough people, it would be a very good start indeed, because that is what needs to happen from the grassroots, people's movements who refuse, who do not accept, demonstrate to the people that you can do it, but it requires, I mean, let us accept it, we don't have a Gandhiji. So it requires a leadership to emerge which can see this through. There will be obstructions. I mean, you can be arrested, but you must have a strategy of how it will happen. And if there is enough in our history to show, to guide us how to do it, if only one was to learn from that history. But in these dark times, efforts like these seem to me personally are good signs that there is an effort to not only tweet and express your opinion, but to actually go down and start a yatra across the country. It makes sense.
Absolutely.
Bhargav, some other questions are there? Please.
Yeah. There is a question from Sundar Mailavarapu. What can we do? What can we do going forward to help reverse this march towards fascism?
Since I've been a teacher for the last more than 4 decades, we deal with young people all the time, and often, particularly the young people would ask, "Sir, but what can I do?" Especially in this current situation where you cannot, I mean, they were not asking us these questions 10 years ago. Then they were telling me what to do, because, ours was a very political campus. They knew how to organize. They would hold protests. They would, do everything. But all that is now out. You cannot, you're beaten up. You're beaten up on video camera, and those who beat you up are not punished. In 2020, in JNU, teachers and students were beaten up in the presence of the police by gundas, all on photograph and cameras. Nobody has been punished, right? So the situation is difficult. So when people ask me, young people ask me, what can I do? If I can speak, I tell them, I'm sure you can speak. You talk, you start with your family. Start with your uncle who votes for the RSS. And let's see, a beginning has to be made. Let's begin wherever we can. I mean, I do not say no to any invitation, even if there are 30 people listening in. Yours is a much bigger one. Let us do what we can. Keeping quiet certainly is not the answer. Or waiting for, the revolutionary movement to arrive. It will not arrive on its own. People have shown that they're active on the social media. Let them express themselves on the social media, as some of them did, and they paid a price for it. People like Gurmeher Kaur, for example. But it made a difference that young people would stand up and at least express themselves on the social media, oppose the trolling that happens.
There are not many questions, and as we are moving towards the conclusion of this session, there is a response from Anil Sadgopalji to your answer for his earlier question. Summing it up, he says so. As Baba Saheb Dr. Ambedkar contended in his speech in Constituent Assembly on 25th November 1949, political democracy is incomplete without social democracy. Unfortunately, this contention has by and large been ignored so far, even in the liberal discourse. This fault line can be traced to the incomplete narrative of the national liberation movement, which I also try to point out in my two questions.
Anil, you would like to add?
No difference of opinion on that. That political democracy must involve social democracy, and social democracy involves caste, class, any other, any kind of gender or any other kind of oppression. Surely, and I think the best of our nationalist leaders were very well aware of it and took it in that spirit. You know, Gandhiji gave up politics for 2 years after the 1932 movement. And if I said for 2 years, I'm going to just travel all over the country and take up only the issue of untouchability and temple entry and the caste. So obviously, it is not as if it was something that was not known, that you cannot have nation building if you ignore something as horrifying as the system of caste discrimination. Absolutely, I couldn't agree with you.
Anil, you would like to add a few words to the what you came to comment?
Let me try. I'm not very good at speaking, but let me try. What I'm trying to point out that the national liberation movement discourse, the narrative, will be incomplete, not only in terms of ideology, but also in its capacity to communicate with the larger masses of the country. If the issues of caste, patriarchy, race are not in the forefront, and the anti-imperialist discourse invariably gets the upper hand, and rightly so also, but it is really incomplete discourse if you don't connect it with the anti-caste, anti-patriarchy, anti-race discourse in the same period. And what I want to focus upon is that I'm very much aware of Gandhi-Ambedkar discourse from 1932 Yeravada prison debate between the two great leaders of our country. I'm also aware, which I want to point out, the democratic dimension of that discourse between the two people. When Dr. Ambedkar, in his Annihilation of Caste, critiqued Mahatma Gandhi, Gandhi published serialized the entire anti-caste annihilation and the annihilation of caste write up by Dr. Ambedkar in his Harijan, serialized. Then Dr. Ambedkar criticized Mahatma Gandhi's, inability to take a stand against the caste system, but talking about untouchability, of course, but you can read all this available on the internet now. So he criticized Gandhi again, and then Gandhiji responded to the criticism of Ambedkar, and then again Ambedkar criticized Gandhiji, and Gandhiji went ahead and serialized the entire debate, something which is impossible to happen today. You'll be in the prison, NIA will be after you, ED will be after you if you do all this today to the leadership of our country. So this I'm very much aware of. I'm fully aware of that when Nehruji could not think of the appropriate person to chair the drafting committee of the constitution, then Gandhiji called Nehruji and said, look, why are you worrying about it? We have Dr. Ambedkar. It's a very well-known fact about the Dr. Ambedkar becoming chairperson. But what I'm saying, the whole narrative of only the anti-imperialist narrative is incomplete description of what was happening from mid-19th century onwards. Of course, we can talk about Buddha also. I've written also. I agree with Aditya ji that the anti-caste movement began 5,000 years ago with Buddha. I fully agree with him. But the dimension after mid-19th century changed totally. The whole education system today is founded on promoting education for the upper caste, upper classes, and basically for the men, for the boys, and for the adolescent boys. And this is all now borne out by the data on education, which is available. Nothing is changing in that respect. All this was brought out by the anti-caste movement. Shahuji Maharaj, who's not known in the country, widely. Shahuji Maharaj from 1994 onwards up to 1920 created a universally available, entirely free, state-funded, free common school system, the first and the last common school system of India, where everybody studied together. Don't forget, in the hostel which is set up, children from various religious background, various caste background, Muslims included, all lived and studied together. These are revolutionary happenings of the country. We should be highlighted in all discourses about what happened from mid-19th century onwards. And when you look into the debate in the Imperial Assembly from 1911, where Gopal Krishna Gokhale's bill on free and compulsory education, the debate which followed, I'm just referring to one statement by the Maharaja of Bardhaman, who said it is wrong to keep mixing Bhangis, he used the word Bhangis and upper caste people, the Brahmins together. For Brahmins and Bhangis both cannot learn. Both cannot be expected to learn the numerals and the letters because Bhangis are unable to learn. This is all recorded, well recorded. So all this should be brought out openly. And this we are still fighting. It's not only the Dalit boy who tried to drink water from the earthen pot who was killed. Just few days before that, before the 75th anniversary of 15th August, a few days before that, a girl studying in class 10 in a village school of Western Madhya Pradesh in my state, near Ujjain and Indore area. She was returning after finishing the school. She was stopped by upper caste RSS type elements who stopped her and said, the words were, "Tumne himmat kaise ki school jane ki? How dare you go to the school?" This happens in 2020, in the 75th year of our independence. Yes. And she said, "I will continue to go to school." So they went to her family and beaten up everyone. A couple of people died. Now, this is something not just to be recalled again and again. This is symptomatic of what has been going wrong in our entire discourse about nation building for the last 150 years. It's always dominant. You see, people have written about it in 1920, 1920, that period, when Congress party was well constituted and Gandhiji was trying to change it from an elite movement to a mass movement. That is what he did from Champaran movement onwards. So at that time, this was noted that the entire elite leading the Congress party is criticizing the discrimination and the wrongdoings of the British Raj, rightly so. But it is not referring to what is going wrong in the Indian society. What is wrong with the Indian society? That is not being discussed. That's always been in the background. Gandhi's battle against untouchability is most welcome and to be respected. But that is not the answer to the Brahminical hegemony in India. That is not the answer. As Ambedkar wrote in his response to Gandhiji, and now it's in Harijan, published in Harijan, that Gandhiji is saying that he's asking people to sweep toilets, to clean toilets, in order for the upper caste people to sort of save their souls. He said, my fight is not about saving souls of the upper caste. My fight is to demolish the caste system. Where it is in the national discourse even today.
Thank you, Anil.
That's all I want to say.
Yeah, please. Thank you, Anil. So we are moving towards concluding the meeting. This is for the excellent presentation. And what Aditya ji said, one thing which I really like, freedom is not divisible. Fight for freedom for others. We have to that is the major lesson which we have to draw from today. The situation is really bad, and whatever we got to do, we should continue with that struggle, with that debate. Thank you all. Thank you, Professor Aditya Mukherjee, for accepting our invitation. Thank you all for joining the debate, and thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sudesh. Thank you, Subhashji, and so many others. Thank you very much.